On the 20th of June 1837, a 19-year-old girl was given the keys to the wealthiest empire in the world. It was hard to believe that less than a year before, the same girl was being practically abused, certainly by today's standards, by her mother and her mother's consort, Sir John Conroy. Princess Victoria should never have been queen. However, upon the death of Princess Charlotte in 1817, she was the only grandchild of King George and the only direct heir to the throne. From a young age, her mother and Sir John Conroy created a protection bubble called the Kensington system. These were very strict rules and regulations designed to weaken the young princess and make her dependent solely on them. Victoria saw this as an attempt to seize power when she learned of a royal lineage when she was 14, and this was further strengthened when she became seriously ill, and Sir John Conroy tried to force her to sign documents, forcing her into a regency well past her 18th birthday, when she would come of age. Princess Victoria was finally released from her manipulative family's grasp in the early hours of the morning on the 20th of June 1837. For the first time in her life, she was greeted by Lord Cunningham and the Archbishop of Canterbury on her own, in her dressing gown no less, as they kissed her hand, proclaiming her the new queen. From that instant she became fiercely independent from her family, strong-willed and determined to prove her points, and ruled as a successful queen and the second longest reigning monarch until her death on the 22nd of January 1901. Now what does all of this have to do with the railway? Well, her rule covered the majority of the Industrial Revolution, where the age of steam began to take shape and factories began to emerge. In fact, by the time she died, the British Empire had expanded exponentially. There is no doubt that the Queen's personality and drive helped influence this, like the changes she had to undergo from being princess to queen. Queen Victoria embraced revolution. She did a lot of firsts as monarch. She was the first queen to be called Victoria. She was the first queen to be given chloroform during childbirth. And she was the first British monarch to travel by train. The title of first British royal, however, to travel by train, does not belong to Victoria. This actually belongs to her aunt, Queen Adelaide. She travelled by train for the first time in 1840, 2 years before the Queen thought about riding in a carriage. Queen Adelaide travelled a respectable distance from Nottingham to Leeds. Following this successful run, Queen Adelaide had a special royal carriage commissioned in 1840, and this carriage resides in the National Railway Museum to this day. Persuaded by her husband, Prince Albert, who loved new inventions, the Queen decided to try this new and rather scary mode of transport on June 13, 1842. The Queen took her family from Windsor Castle to Slough railway station, where, for the first time ever, they boarded a royal saloon carriage. The carriage was built by the Great Western Railway and had a padded silk ceiling and beautiful velvet sofas and fringed lampshades with big wooden tables and fur carpets. It was more likened to a stateroom than a mode of transport. The engine that pulled this impressive coach was called Peg-Leviathan. It was a Firefly class and had been built the same year. On the footplate was driver Daniel Gooch and an unassuming fireman who you may have heard of, Islamabad Kingdom Brunel. The Queen and her family travelled from Slough to Paddington, taking 25 minutes. To give you an idea of the speed nowadays, it only takes 14 minutes. And both driver and fireman managed to get their engine up to an impressive 42 miles an hour. Now, one of the ways that her mother and Sir John Conroy enforced control over the young princess was for her to write diaries. This way they could monitor the princess's feelings and moods every day. Sometimes they would make her write up to 2,500 words a day. Incredibly, the Queen still kept up this tradition right up to her death. These diaries have been a blessing as we get the innermost thoughts of the Queen, especially after she went into seclusion following the death of her husband. The Queen wrote in her diary that she was quite charmed by this new way of travelling. However, she was worried health-wise to travel at the speed which the locomotive could go. So she insisted that if she ever used the royal carriages again, that they never went more than 30 miles an hour. She felt that any engine went faster than that would be detrimental to her. So much was her worry that she even commissioned a special signal to be fitted in her saloon so she could alert the train driver directly if she felt he was going too fast. The Queen loved the railway. It allowed her freedom to travel in splendid comfort without the uncomfortable days travelling along bumpy roads. As technology advanced, it also allowed her the freedom to work while on the move. In 1869, after using saloons that were made for her by the London and South Western Railway, Queen Victoria contacted them and commissioned them to build a specialist saloon car. This was originally 2 vehicles. However, the Queen felt uncomfortable travelling between the 2 carriages while the train was in motion, so she commissioned that the underframe be fused together. It became her favourite mode of transport and allowed her to travel to her beloved Balmoral, so much so that a station was built just for her purpose, and that station is still used to this day. To commemorate the royal carriages, the exterior panels were painted with the royal arms and the badges of the Bath, the Fizzle, the Garter and St Patrick. The Queen chose the interior herself and is the first of its kind to contain toilet facilities. It also accommodated for her ladies-in-waiting and personal servants. Separate rooms were also created, and a second royal bedchamber was created for her children. The Queen also refused to accept any form of gas lighting in the saloon, as it's likely, although not proven, that the refusal of the gas lamps could have been down to a traumatic experience in Buckingham Palace, where one of her servants was severely burnt when she tried to light the gas lamps. Instead, she relied on oil lamps and candle holders until electric lights were fitted later. The Queen's husband Albert died at the age of 42 in 1861, nearly 8 years prior to the saloon's building. The Queen fell into a deep mourning and became very sheltered. She also never wore any other colour than black, and many people assumed that her black wardrobe extended to her fixtures and fittings, but this is actually not the case. The Queen furnished the saloon in royal blues and golds. It included a living room style suite, which allowed her to carry on with important matters of court while she was on the move. Today, high-speed railway trains make the journey from London to Edinburgh in a space about 4 hours, but due to speed restrictions that Victoria imposed, an average trip would take about 10 hours. For the secluded Queen, this was almost perfect, as nobody could bother her. The railway was so important that the Queen even had a private station in London, exclusive for her use. The station was opened in 1854 near Waterloo. It had its own private waiting room, fountains and gardens, and was used by the Queen and dignitaries alike when they came to visit the capital. Following the death of her husband, the Queen rarely used the station, and sadly it was destroyed in 1878 to allow the expansion of the existing Waterloo station. When the Queen died in 1901, the coffin was symbolically carried to Paddington Station, and she recreated her very first journey 60 years earlier back to Windsor, where she was buried next to her beloved husband. Even though the railway station in London has been demolished, the railway station in Balmoral is still in use to this day, and has seen its share of royalty. Other royal trains have been commissioned since Victoria's time, and you can see many of them at the Railway Museum, but I'll be focusing on those individually at a later date. Nowadays, our current Queen very rarely takes out the royal train, as it's seen as an unnecessary expense. She much prefers to travel first class with her ladies and her servants by her side. So if you are lucky enough to travel first class and is heading up to Scotland from London and the Queen is about, don't be surprised if you pass her in the carriages.